When the Soviet DShK first arrived at the Eastern Front during World War II, it completely obliterated the German infantry and light armor. The Americans called it the 50 cal heavy machine gun, or the Red 50 during the Korean War. However, the DShK actually used an even more powerful round than the American 50 BMG, and what it did to the Wehrmacht and American army is genuinely hard to stomach. So today we're going to explain exactly how this weapon compared to the M2 Browning and what it did to the people on the other side. Alright, so the first time the DShK actually proved itself as the work of art it would later be known as was during the siege of Leningrad. When the Germans rolled up to the city in September 1941, they had complete air superiority, and they were using it to flatten Leningrad block by block. The Red Army needed a weapon that could actually punch back at the low-flying Stukas and Junkers blowing the city to bits, and the DShK was about the only weapon they had that could actually reach that high with enough power to drop a plane. Now, to understand how the Soviets even had this thing ready in time, you have to rewind a decade. In the late 1920s, the Red Army was watching the Americans develop the infamous M2 Browning, and they wanted their own homegrown version of it. So they handed the project to a designer named Vasily Degtyaryov in 1929, and by 1931 he had a working prototype, but the early gun had a problem nobody could ignore. It fed from a clunky 30-round drum that sat on top of the receiver, and the rate of fire was nowhere near what the army actually needed in a real fight. So another designer named Georgi Shpagin stepped in around 1937, scrapped the drum entirely, and replaced it with a proper belt-fed system. The new weapon went into production in 1938 as the DShK, named after both of its creators, and the Soviet finally had their own 50 cal-esque heavy machine gun. The cartridge they built it around was the 12.7 by 108 millimeters, and this is where things start getting interesting compared to the American 50. The Soviet round has a case that's 9 millimeters long than the 50 BMG, holds about 22.7 cubic centimeters of powder, and fires a heavier 48 to 55 gram steel cored bullet. In raw kinetic energy, the Soviet round can hit close to 19,000 joules at the muzzle, which is actually on the upper end of what the American 50 BMG produces with most service loads. By the time the Germans crossed the border in Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army finally had a heavy machine gun that could match the Browning round for round, and back in Leningrad, the Soviets began bolting it onto literally anything that could carry it. You'd find them on the roofs of factories, on the decks of armored boats sailing the Lake Ladoga supply route, and on flatbed gas trucks racing through the streets to defend buildings who were targeted by German bombers. The 12.7 by 108 millimeter round it fired could reach up to 2.4 kilometers, and it had more than enough energy to rip straight through the engine block of a German bomber. The gun also came with two clever spider web ring sights mounted on top, designed to help the gunner lead a fast-moving aircraft, which was something the M2 Browning never had built in, and because the gun fired at around 600 rounds per minute with a butterfly trigger between two wooden grips, a single gunner could swing it across the sky and walk a stream of tracers right into a diving Stuka. However, the real horror began when they began testing it against German riflemen instead of airplanes. When the German infantry tried to push closer to the city, the Soviets dropped the DShK off its anti-aircraft tripod and rolled it onto a two-wheeled carriage. In that configuration, the entire setup weighed a hefty 346 pounds, but it gave the gun a small armored shield and turned it into something that could shred infantry from over a mile away. If you as a soldier were hit in the torso by even one 12.7 millimeter round, you almost always instantly died due to the severe destruction of internal organs, and at the ranges the DShK was firing from, the Germans usually never even saw the gun position before half their squad was down. You see, this is the same problem the Wehrmacht had with the American 50 cal later in the war, just on a different front. Their MG34s and MG42s were brilliant weapons, but they were firing the same 8mm Mauser round their fathers used in World War I. So the DShK simply outranged them, and there wasn't much you could do about it from the receiving end. The Germans were so impressed when they captured these guns that they actually reused them against their original owners, which tells you everything about how the Wehrmacht felt about the weapon. By the time the siege ended in January 1944, the Soviets had figured out exactly what they had on their hands. But Leningrad was just the warm-up for the real test of the DShK. At the start of 1942, the Red Army actually only had about 720 DShKs in their entire inventory, which is genuinely shocking when you think about how big the Eastern Front was. So when the Germans rolled into Stalingrad in the summer of 1942, the Soviets were rushing every single one they could produce straight to the city. The DShK was bolted onto Project 1124 armored boats that ferried troops and supplies across the Volga Volga River under constant Luftwaffe fire. These twin DShK mounts on the boats became the only reason the resupply runs even worked, because without them, the Stukas would have sunk every boat trying to cross. Now, once the gun got into the city itself, it found a second use that the designers never really planned for. Soviet snipers and machine gunners started dragging DShKs into the upper floors of bombed-out apartment blocks, and they used the height to fire down into German positions across the rubble. A regular MG-34 round would be absorbed by thick brick walls or sandbags, but the DShK round just punched straight through, and that changed how the fighting in the city actually worked. Germans hiding behind walls or in basement window slits suddenly weren't safe anymore, because the Soviets could spray a belt through the wall to get them. Now, the gun did have one major drawback that the Soviets had to work around. Resupplying ammunition for it was a nightmare, because every 50-round non-disintegrating belt was made of solid metal links that couldn't just be torn apart on the move. A loader had to manually thread the belt into the rotary feed cylinder on the right side, and if that cylinder jammed in the middle of an air raid, the gun was basically a paperweight until someone could clear it. But despite that, production was ramping up fast, going from those 720 guns at the start of 1942 to over 5,000 by 1943. By the time Field Marshal Paulus surrendered the German 6th Army in February 1943, the DShK had earned its nickname among the Soviet troops, Dushka, which roughly means darling or sweetie in Russian. A bit of a sick joke when you think about what the gun actually did to people on the other end of it. By 1944, the Red Army was no longer on the back foot and were now actively running down the Wehrmacht. So Soviet engineers swapped out the complicated old muzzle brake for a much simpler design copied from a Polish anti-tank rifle, which made the gun cheaper and faster to produce. This let them mass-produce DShKs at a scale they had never managed before, and total wartime production hit around 9,000 guns by the end of the war. Now, as the Red Army pushed west toward Berlin, the DShK got bolted onto basically every heavy vehicle they were rolling out of the factory. The new IS-2 heavy tank carried one as an anti-aircraft mount, and so did the massive ISU-152 self-propelled guns that were knocking out German Tiger tanks at long range, and you could even find the gun on Soviet armored trains, which would patrol the rail lines behind the front and use the DShK to swat down any German fighter brave enough to try a strafing run. But the real change was how the Soviets used it on infantry now. In street fighting through Königsberg and then Berlin itself, Soviet assault squads used the DShK as a portable bunker buster. A 12.7mm round could go through about 20mm of armor at 500 meters, which meant most German half-tracks, armored cars, and even the side armor of a Panzer IV wasn't safe from it at close range. So instead of waiting for tank support to clear a fortified house or pillbox, Soviet shock troops would just wheel a DShK around the corner and dump 50 rounds into the door or window. Whatever was inside, well, it was no longer a problem after that. When Berlin fell in May 1945, the DShK had become as iconic for the Red Army as the M2 was for the Americans on the Western Front. But it wouldn't take long after the end of the Second World War before it entered a new one, and now the same gun that had killed Germans started killing Americans. When the Korean War kicked off in June 1950, the Soviets had been sneakily sending DShKs to the North Koreans for years, and when Chinese forces poured across the Yalu River later that year, they brought their own version called the Type 54, which was basically a license-built copy of the DShK-M. The Americans had never really seen this gun in action before, and they had almost no information on it. A Soviet weapons expert named Roger Marsh actually wrote in 1950 that the American military's lack of familiarity with Soviet military firearms was a serious problem during the early days of the Korean War. The North Koreans, on the other hand, had been trained on both Soviet and American weapons, so they knew exactly what they were doing. American troops gave it the nickname Red 50 because they were used to their own M2 Browning, but the Red 50 had one nasty advantage the Americans didn't expect. When Chinese forces dug DShKs into mountain ridges along the front, they could fire down on American positions from over 2 kilometers away. The 12.7 by 108mm round has a slightly longer case than the American 50 BMG, and the ballistics of the Soviet round meant it could carry serious energy out to long ranges where American 30 caliber machine guns were basically useless. So American patrols would suddenly take fire from a hilltop they couldn't even see, and the rounds were hitting them before they heard the shots. The DShK was also the main anti-aircraft threat against the new American helicopters being used for medevac, like the Bell H-13 Sioux made famous by MASH. A medevac chopper trying to lift wounded out of a hot landing zone made a perfect target for a dug-in DShK crew, and a single hit to the rotor mast or engine was usually fatal for everyone on board. By the time the armistice was signed in July 1953, the Soviets had already started exporting the modernized DShK-M, which was easier to produce and used a simpler shuttle feed system instead of that troublesome rotary cylinder. Over 1 million of these would eventually roll off production lines in places like Poland, Romania, China, and Iran, which is part of why this gun ended up in basically every conflict for the rest of the century. But the worst was still coming for American troops, as they would now face them in North Vietnamese hands instead of Chinese a few decades later. The French had built their entire defensive plan on the idea that the Vietnamese had no anti-aircraft capability at all, and that resupply by air would just keep working forever. Well, spoiler alert, they were catastrophically wrong about that. By the end of the 57-day siege, the French had lost 62 aircraft destroyed or badly damaged, the airstrip was unusable, and 11,721 French troops were marched into captivity. A huge chunk of those aircraft losses were credited to the DShK specifically, because the gun was small enough to be hidden in casemates dug into the mountainside and pulled out only to fire a few quick bursts. When the war in Vietnam escalated in the mid-1960s, the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong had access to thousands of DShKs flowing down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The gun was light enough to be broken down and carried by a small team through the jungle, and unlike heavier anti-aircraft cannons, you didn't need a truck to move it. This made it a nightmare for American helicopter pilots, who were the backbone of the entire American war effort in Vietnam. You see, the helicopter was basically how the Americans got everywhere in Vietnam. It moved troops into landing zones, it pulled wounded out, and it delivered supplies to fire bases scattered across the jungle. So if you could shoot down enough helicopters, you could cripple the way the entire war was fought. And that's exactly what the DShK started doing. Of the 7,500 helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft the Americans lost during the Vietnam War, most were destroyed by anti-aircraft guns, including the DShK. That number is genuinely hard to wrap your head around. The North Vietnamese would set up DShK ambush positions around known American landing zones, and they would wait for a Huey to come in low and slow on its final approach. Then, 6 or 7 DShKs would open up at once from concealed positions in the tree line, and the helicopter usually didn't survive the first burst. Even if the pilot somehow got his bird back into the air, a single 12.7mm round hitting the gearbox or main rotor would take the chopper down within seconds. The Americans actually started designing their next generation of helicopters specifically around this threat. The AH-64 Apache, the M2 Bradley, and the Striker were all later required to be hardened against direct hits from 12.7mm rounds, and that requirement came directly out of what the DShK did to American forces in Southeast Asia. But the most ironic chapter of the DShK's whole story was still to come. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, they expected a quick operation against poorly armed mountain tribesmen. What they got instead was a decade-long nightmare where their own weapon was used to slaughter their helicopter crews. The Mujahideen had access to thousands of Chinese Type 54s smuggled in through Pakistan as part of the CIA's Operation Cyclone. They also captured a steady supply of original DShKs from Afghan government depots and from Soviet vehicles they ambushed in the mountain passes. Now, Afghanistan is mostly mountains, and the Soviets were relying heavily on helicopters to get troops and supplies between fire bases. So just like the Americans in Vietnam, they were sending Mi-8 transport helicopters into landing zones surrounded by ridgelines, and the Mujahideen positioned DShK crews on the high ground above every major valley and choke point, and they waited. The very first Mi-8 shot down by a DShK in Afghanistan happened on January 9th, 1980, less than 3 weeks into the entire war. However, the Soviets had actually prepared for this. After watching the Americans get torn apart in Vietnam, Soviet engineers had specifically designed the new Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter to shrug off 50 caliber fire. The Hind had armored cockpits, armored engines, and titanium rotor components, and the DShK round mostly just bounced off it. But the Mi-8 transport, which was the workhorse of the Soviet airlift effort, had no such protection. So the Mujahideen learned to ignore the Hinds when possible and focus all their fire on the troop carriers. The Soviets also ran into another problem they hadn't seen coming. Their standard practice was to lightly oil the DShK ammunition belts to prevent corrosion, but in the dusty Afghan environment, that oil film just collected sand and grit and clogged the feed mechanism mid-burst. So even when Soviet tank crews on T-62s tried to use their own DShK-Ms to fire back at Mujahideen positions on ridgelines, the gun would jam at the worst possible moment. By the time the Soviets withdrew in February 1989, they had lost at least 333 helicopters and 118 jets across the entire war, and a huge portion of those kills were credited to DShKs the Soviets themselves had built decades earlier. But the gun didn't stop there either. In 1988, the IRA smuggled DShKs from Libya into Northern Ireland, and they used them to bring down a British Westland Lynx helicopter near County Armagh that June. In Syria, Iraq, and Libya, the DShK became the standard weapon mounted on the back of pickup trucks, creating those technicals you see in every news report. A single arms survey in Somalia counted at least 466 DShKs in active use across the country, and warlords during the Battle of Mogadishu used them to chew through light vehicles and harass American forces from rooftops and technicals across the city.